You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I want to thank you for joining me again. And this week we are in the Haftarah Yitro. Last week I left the Haftarah Beshalach as a recording that I already did in the past with the book of Judges, and I didn't see any point in redoing it again, so I just left it as it is. And the reading itself, we based ourselves on chapter 5, because that's where that's really what the chapter we discussed when I did that recording all those years ago. I really didn't see any point in remaking an episode that I haven't really changed any of my stances on. And I will actually, by the way, point out that there is one thing that I did look up more extensively in regards to one of the verses in Judges 5, when it says, Bifra P'ra'ot b'Yisrael baruchu Adonai. P'ra'ot. I just, years ago, I had a discussion with someone about that specific word, and someone wanted to say that Ain and Tzadi interchange, and therefore P'ra'ot is Bratzot, which is breaches, or we can talk about walls being breached or something like that. And they based themselves on the Aramaic. The problem was I actually checked this and discovered that the interchanging Ain Tzadi in Hebrew and Aramaic dates to a much, much, much later stage, while the research done, it's still agreed upon that the Song of Devorah is a very, very early stage Hebrew, very, very early stage song. Most of the songs in the Bible are considered to be very, very old. I mean, songs like from the Songs of Moses, the Song on the Sea, and so on. There actually is a book by Cross and Friedman. It's not an easy book to come by these days. I was able to find a copy and read through it. And they actually discuss a lot of the research for what they think was the original form of the song and so on. But they found, and most scholars still agree on this, that the song itself is much, much older. So this idea of P'ra'ot, Bratzot, is not specifically correct. And the interchanging of Ain and Tzadi belongs to a much, much later stage of Aramaic and Hebrew being in contact with one another. Actually, to make this have a much more clear context, because I'm pulling this out, because my expectancy is that you've actually listened to the previous recording, and that makes it a little bit unfair, because there are people who might be listening to this recording regardless of the previous reading and so on, which is something that happens. So I just want to tell you exactly where the reference is. It's actually straight at the beginning, before P'ra'ot b'Yisrael mitnadev am baruchu Adonai. When lawlessness, P'ra'ot, Pera, there's a whole bunch of questions in regards to the specific words, things that we didn't address in the previous recording. When maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but it's a really good opportunity to bring this up again. That para really means something which is wild. So P'ra'ot is usually when there's some kind of wildness, when there's no control. One of the arguments I had heard against this type of interpretation is that people say, well, you're automatically thinking we're talking about a pogrom or something like that. But before P'ra'ot, I mean, again, this could be a rare occurrence of a specific word that we don't really hear much throughout the Bible, but the root para means wildness, something that's untamed, something which is out of control. This, by the way, I actually did a check, and if I'm not mistaken, the verb itself, para, only appears about 16 times throughout the entire Bible, 16 or 18 times, something like that, and it always has to do with making something wild. So there was this interesting discussion that I keep on seeing about head covering for women. It says in Numbers, it's 5 or 6. It says maybe even 4. Give me a second here. I'll actually check to make sure. But there's a whole discussion about the sotah, the woman who is accused by her husband for committing adultery, but he has no evidence of this. And you should go listen to actually what I say there. Yeah, it is chapter 5. It says "Ufara et rosh ha'isha." A lot of people think para is to expose. That's actually a very late use of the Hebrew verb, and we actually don't find any evidence whatsoever of women actually covering their hair as an obligation. It's more of a status that you may or may not practice. It really depends on the culture. This practice of completely covering the hair, always saying you have to cover your head, also, by the way, applies to men. This rule of modesty is actually something that was probably adopted from the Persians. So there's a massive difference between what people think the Bible says and what it was actually the original intent. I'm right now discussing the subject of late interpretation versus early interpretation and the context people give things to material during the Second Temple. I've been having some discussions with two of my professors about this. And it's very, very complicated because we need to understand that the Bible was still, being discussed, and there were still questions that people were asking themselves about what things actually mean, and everyone was interpreting things in different ways. So it's always very, very complicated. If we're already talking about Second Temple scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls. So I actually want to bring this up for a moment because it actually connects to our reading. So as I said, we're reading. I said last week was Beshalach, this week is Yitro. I am specifically going to be reading the reading practiced by the Sephardic Jews and the Yemenites. I don't want to do the Ashkenaz. The Ashkenaz reading carries on into a whole discussion about the enemies of King Achaz and so on. I really don't want to go into that one because it doesn't really work well with with the discussion that we actually have in our reading of Yitro, which is the Ten Commandments and the revelation of Mount Sinai. I remember I once had this really interesting discussion with someone, and we never really finalized it, which was a real shame. I sometimes get really interesting notifications from people that contact me, and this person I haven't spoken with for a very long time, which is a real shame. But they wanted to argue that there actually isn't any evidence in the reading of Exodus or Shemot 20 that was actually God who spoke, even though it's explicit. But we never really finished the discussion. But the thing is that everyone has always understood it was God that spoke, and this was an actual revelation of God on Mount Sinai. And this was the only case ever in history that God actually appeared before everyone. I would say, by the way, that would have been very, very interesting, for example, to read Elijah at Mount Chorev, at Eliyahu at Har Chorev, because it still fits very, very nicely with one another. However, we read that one for a different reading, so we leave that one alone so we go to a different revelation, and there's actually a very, very specific logic that goes through why do we specifically read, and we're going to be reading from Isaiah, Isaiah 6, Isaiah's consecration, his dedication as a prophet. And there's a very, very simple logic of why we specifically read this one, which I will explain in a moment. But the reason I brought up the Dead Sea Scrolls a moment ago is because I actually had a discussion just before Shabbat, which was really interesting. And I didn't realize when I was having this discussion, or I didn't think at that given moment that I need to be recording this specific Haftarah. I wasn't thinking about it, and I brought up this whole subject of angels. Now, there's a really interesting book that is actually the PhD dissertation of I think he's now Professor Alexander Lefebvre, where he writes about angels. And angels is a really, really interesting subject because they undergo an evolution. It's a very interesting thing, and I think I've addressed this before. And I brought this up during an open discussion with some of my classmates and with the conduction of our professor, and I brought this fact up that angels are depicted really in earlier stages of the Tanakh as being just ish, very common term that we find for angels in early stories of the Tanakh is there's an ish appears. Avraham sees Anashim, Lot sees Anashim, the wife of Manoach, mother of Samson, sees an Ish. An Ish appears here, an Ish appears here and there. And it's very interesting that we see this evolution. Now, Alexander will actually wrote his PhD on this whole subject because it is a very interesting subject where we see how the image of angels evolves throughout time. Now, the question is this really an evolution, or was this always the established understanding that when an angel appears on earth and speaks with human beings, he looks like a human? But when a person, a prophet, speaks with an angel, the angel appears as an angel, which means they take upon themselves a different form when they appear before a human being. And the thing that always strikes me is that we hear about this idea of keruvim, of cherubs, and they sit on top of the ark, and their wings are on top of the ark and everything. And most people say, listen, it's probably only 2 pairs of wings for each cherub, which indicates that that there was an early understanding that cherubs or angels of sorts were a lot more complicated than just seeing an ish, just seeing a man. And a lot of scholars going in this direction. And again, I have to reread all that material. It's a very long book because it's an old school type of PhD where they wrote, hundreds of pages and volumes that went with it and so on. I don't remember everything that was said there, but he does point out to like an evolutionary structure where the angels become more and more and more complicated. And he ends up going into the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, I'm going to touch on that in a moment. And what's very, very interesting is the fact that really when we start seeing angels in latter books, like the book of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, not so much, but especially Isaiah and Ezekiel, and there's a parallel here. There's parallels between Yeshayahu and Yechezkel, Isaiah and Ezekiel. There's some parallels between them. And this raised the question in the scholarly world, why do we see angels like this and angels like that? So the usual answer is it's an evolution. The more the society evolved, the more it came in contact with other people, especially the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They start hearing angels that look like that. However, if we go back to the idea of the cherubs and go back to King Solomon and so on, and we say, and for the argument's sake, we say that the ark was the inspiration for the cherubs that were in King Solomon's temple, and that there were cherubs on the walls, and the cherubs he put above the ark and everything. The idea of winged beings had already existed. And really, when you go back, winged beings are something that we hear about much, much earlier than that. So I want to present a different argument. And again, this is not an academic paper where I'm going to present exact arguments and so on. But what I am going to say is the following, that we have 2 separate realms. I've actually always taught the subject of the temple as 2 separate realms, that the human realm and the divine realm touch one another, and depending, if you think about 2 circles that have a point where they touch one another, which is the temple. And the temple is like a doorway into the divine world. And it depends who you are. Depending on who you are, the amount of information that you're supposed to receive about that world increases. So, when a regular person who's not a prophet, or a person who is not supposed to know that what's standing in front of him is an angel, sees a man, doesn't see anything beyond that. But when the person sees beyond the veil, when it's not on our earthly realm, when the person sees beyond the veil, they start seeing what that world really looks like. Because there's a veil between mankind and God. So God sometimes moves the veil a little bit to show a human being something, and then the human being knows understands what's in front of him, understands the universe better, and that amount of revelation makes the person understand the world around him better. But a person who doesn't have to have that purpose, or a person who's doing something a little different, then they're not exposed to that. But it's still very interesting that, for example, the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and especially Avraham and Yaakov, they do meet anashim in different ways, men in different ways. It's still very interesting that they still see just men. It's possible because the purpose was different. So this kind of rolls back into this whole discussion that we have, that Breuer, for example, brings up, where he says the same, not only Boyle, but Kasuto in his time when he was around, and Boyle. I don't think Boyle is still alive anymore, but he lived on well into the 2000s. And they made the argument that there's different levels of revelation. Sometimes it's Yud Hei Vav Hei, sometimes Elohim, sometimes Adonai. And the revelation based on the name Adonai is actually very important to our reading as well. And that and each person, depending on who they are and what they are, appear. And each person has, not appear, they have an appearance in front of them based on what's necessary for them to know. Now, how does this connect to the Dead Sea Scrolls? It's a really interesting thing. Because Dead Sea Scrolls, first of all, Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot of writings, like the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch, especially Enoch. Enoch has a super duper, highly developed, I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced, but it's the study of angels. It's angelology or something like that. There's some weird name that I can never pronounce correctly. And the level of discussion about angels there is the angels now have names. This, by the way, really strongly connects to the book of Daniel as well. Daniel has a very highly developed sense of what angels are. This is why many scholars at least say that there are segments there that were probably inserted later, but that's a whole discussion by itself. Book of Daniel, very complicated book. And a lot of the ideas in Enoch and Jubilees and other pseudo-epigraphic writings, which speak in the name of some angel or some ancient character and so on, belong to that literature of the highly developed angelic world. And that's something that is so developed there. There are really specific choirs of angels and so on and so forth. Now, how detached are these things that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Bible? Not that too far away. There are probably things about what people believed in that we are not completely aware of, that we only see glimpses of these things when we read the Tanakh. And Isaiah 6 is one of these examples. Isaiah 6, the first 10, 11 chapters of Yechezkel have a lot of these creatures, these angels show up, which give us kind of insight into the reality that there are some ideas that we see in Second Temple Judaism that are not necessarily far removed from the Bible. Why do I say this? Because there is this discussion that exists about maybe there's a difference between Second Temple Judaism and First Temple Judaism, not Judaism, but Judean practices and Israeli practices of the North. However, there are probably things that we just don't know. And why do I bring this up? Why is this so important for me to say this? Is because one of the things that's happened with me in the last couple of months is I've been communicating with a certain researcher who happens to be one of my professors as well. We've been having some really lengthy discussions about what's really known, what's not known, what do we understand, what we don't understand. And he said to me something which I think is one of the most straightforward things I've ever heard a scholar say. And he's not the only one who said this, but I've had other teachers say the same thing, but it was good to hear this again from a person like him. What he said to me was, there's a limitation to what we actually can know. We can speculate until we're blue in the face. There are scholars who do this all the time. They get radical ideas, they throw in, it's very, very complicated, some of the stuff that we hear. And I remember walking away from this discussion and then having another much shorter discussion with a different teacher of mine, but on the same principles. And it always makes me wonder about what do we really know about the divine world and what people actually believed in, what kind of monotheism, if it was monotheism, and so on. And how much are we actually speculating? How much of the scholarly world is a lot of it is speculation. So it's a really, really interesting thing. And I think one of the most important lessons I heard, and I actually saw it demonstrated in front of my eyes, is this specific professor I was having the long discussion with said to me, one of the biggest dangers of any scholar is that when he has an agenda and he's working hard to prove that agenda. And I sat there and I said, can you give me an example? And he talked about a very specific example, but a person who wrote a specific book, a book that I've encountered and looked through a little bit, because it dealt with a certain subject I was trying to understand. And he said to me, if you want to understand a person who has an agenda and is forcing his opinion on things, read that book. I'm not going to say which book it is. I'm not going to go into that. But he said to me, read that book. And I said, fine, I'll read the book. And I haven't read the book yet, by the way. But I actually haven't, a couple of weeks later, actually met the person who wrote the book. I attended a lecture given by this person, and I walked away from the lecture going, now I understand. Book of Isaiah is probably one of the books with one of the largest numbers of things being written about the book. A lot of literature about this book. One of the dangers is that people have agendas. Everyone has some kind of an agenda when they research. My professor said to me, do yourself a favor. Let the information speak to you. Don't scream at the information. Don't tell the information what to do. Now, the really interesting thing that I found, and this is now, we're going now into why I said there's an interesting connection. Why do we specifically read this one? Is because both the revelation of Mount Sinai and the revelation to Isaiah is God appearing as king. Because when God says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzaticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, lo yelecha Elohim acharim al panei. When God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, you will have no other God before me or with me or whatever you want to translate lefanai is. Because it has a specific translation, but you can translate based on context as well. So you can be before me, with me, in my stead. And in our reading, we see God appearing also, because when he says, I am the Lord your God, he's actually announcing that I am your king. And when Isaiah sees the temple, and he sees all these angels, and he sees God he sees Adonai specifically. He doesn't say Yud Hei Vav. He says, Raiti Adonai Yoshev al Kiseh v'nisau shurav meleim et hayichal. We'll talk about those verses very specifically, in more specification in a moment. Both are supposed to be revelations of a king. God is king. And what's very interesting, there's several connections here. The idea of revelation, the idea of God's place on earth, God being king. But there's a really interesting thing where we need to think about creation of earth, of Adam and Eve, Avraham, all the way to the temple of King Solomon. The whole idea was for God to be king over mankind. So when God appeared at Mount Sinai, he said, I'm your king, you represent me on earth, but I'm also the king of the entire world as well. But I chose you for my reasons. And Isaiah is being chosen as well. He's standing in front of all the different people around him. You have to understand the politics of the time. He's standing there almost by himself in front of massive armies, massive enemies, and they get a redemption from Pharaoh. They get a redemption from Assyria. This specific reading is supposed to be after the death of King Uzziyahu. So Yotam is king right now. He doesn't stay king for very long. And then Achaz takes over, but the biggest story is really the times of King Hezekiah. But both Yotam, actually all four of them, Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, Yechizkiyahu, all the way to the times of Menashe, and the story is that probably Menashe maybe murdered Isaiah. There's such a midrash. They all deal with the looming danger of Assyria in the north. And Assyria does eventually destroy. In the year 734, during the time of the reign of King Uzziyahu, Tiglath-Pileser III goes, attacks. He does his campaign against the Philistines. It goes through Tyre, Philistines, and so on. He destroys parts of the northern kingdom. He threatens Judea as well to some degree. And you have to think about it, that this is like Israel in Egypt, And they're calling up to God, and God said, I will come and save you. Isaiah is the same prophet, but he has his revelation. That's his personal Mount Sinai. And then he goes out and he says, he's like a Moses. He says, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Have faith. And Moshe says the same thing. They won't believe me. They won't have faith in me. And he says, don't worry, they'll have faith in you in the end. And Isaiah ends up being true, because when the Assyrians come over, even the Assyrian documentation, the documentation by Sancheriv, where he says, I destroyed 46 of his cities and everything, and he took over Lachish and so on, but Jerusalem was saved. Isaiah was proven to be right. He said, this city, nothing's going to happen to it. Now, what's the issue with the speculation? I once read a book that the writer was trying to make an argument that there's some kind of a competition between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. This is actually a classic thing that you hear in at least in Introduction to Biblical Studies in some courses. And they try to argue this idea that there's some kind of a competition between these two locations, and that really eventually the covenant of Jerusalem takes over the covenant of Sinai, and then there's this competition because some people want to go back to the covenant of Sinai and ignore Jerusalem and so on. And one of the really interesting things about this is that first of all, I read the book, it was a really well-written book, but I felt very strongly that there were some elements inside it that may try to push to certain directions. It was a really interesting book to read in overall. It was very well written, very, very informative, and so on. But why am I bringing this up? Because when you see a literary connection or some kind of similarity between one thing and the other, it doesn't mean that they're competing with one another. It doesn't mean that this is some kind of other tradition that may exist. And I've been dealing with this a lot lately, where people argue there's a different tradition here, what actually happened and stuff like that. That's sometimes something that I don't really think really works that well, because we need to understand that the Bible itself, even though it does have a lot of different opinions inside it, does still follow a general idea and a general narrative. And the danger is that it doesn't matter who you are, if you start focusing on trying to find what's different and make throw in some kind of an idea that's more radical than the one before you, all you're doing is you're making a discussion just cheap. You're making a discussion pointless. And if you think about the times of Yeshayahu, a long time of uncertainty, Assyria is always looming there, endangering. Isaiah had to deal with people's opinions. Jeremiah had to do the exact same thing. Ezekiel had to do the exact same thing. Arguments exist. The issue is, what evidence do you actually have for your argument? Now, we have to also understand that Isaiah is also a very, very well-established prophet. He's well known amongst the people. And that might be, now I'm actually going to go straight now into the text and transition into a different subject now. Because he's so well established, that actually might be the reason why we only hear about his dedication here. First of all, we don't hear with everyone a dedication ceremony, only the three major prophets. We hear in Isaiah, we hear in Jeremiah, and we hear in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is the most elaborate one, the most complicated one. Isaiah has a much simpler one, but he sees one that's pretty important, pretty intense, and is actually the opposite of one of the visions that Ezekiel has. Ezekiel has a vision of God leaving the temple. Isaiah actually has an image of God in the temple, because there are several hundred years between them. At least 150, if not more, years between Isaiah and Ezekiel. But Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel were not known yet. So we start off with their dedication. Isaiah seems to be, at least in my opinion, there's a reason I say this, much more well known. And the reason he probably is much more well known is because he seems to have some kind of very close relationship with the royal family, to a point where some people argue that he was related to the royal family and he might have been some kind of one of the grandfathers of Menashe, that Isaiah's daughter actually married Hezekiah. Married Hezekiah, and married might have been Hezekiah. Hezekiah married Yeshayahu's daughter, and he was his grandfather. But what's very interesting is that, like Natan, Isaiah has a very strong link into the king's court. That would explain, first of all, maybe why the introductory to the dedication of him as a prophet shows up only in chapter 6, because he's already known. So, first of all, we'll focus on the message. Then we'll talk for a moment about the dedication itself. Even though we have to understand that Isaiah is a very complicated book, it's actually not in sequence. There's a lot of pieces jumping around. Chapter 14 is not really where it's supposed to be, and there are chapters that move around because it builds up to a very specific goal, which is the chapter 36 all the way to 39. But it is a little bit out. There's some stuff. The editing itself is of a very specific style. But it could be that the reason it's inserted here is because Isaiah was very, very well known. Speculation. It is through an idea. Now, what does he actually see? This is a really interesting thing. So it says, Bishnat mot hamelech Oziyahu. This is Isaiah 6, verse 1. The year of the death of King Oziyahu. Oziyahu also appears as Azariahu. He was a leper for a very, very long time. And Yotam actually worked in his stead. Yotam became the king, even though his father was still alive. Uziyahu, Azariahu, there's two variations of his name. It says, Va'eret Adonai. It's not that it appears in Yud Hei Vav He. It actually appears as Aleph Daled Nun Yud, which is really, really interesting. And the explanation is that he sees Adonai, he doesn't see Yud Hei Vav He, is because no one can actually see God himself. And even on Mount Sinai, it says it says in Deuteronomy, he didn't see but a fire. He didn't really see God himself. So it's kind of hinting the idea that what he's seeing is an imagery. It's some kind of something that's supposed to represent God, but it's not really God himself. I think that Ezekiel has the exact same thing, that he sees something there on the chariot, but he doesn't really see it. It says, Yoshev al Kisei Ram Venisa, sitting on a very high and exalted throne, which is supposed to represent God's authority as king. And he's not, what's interesting, he's not sitting on cherubs. The cherubs are around him. The angels are around him. He's actually not sitting on them. And this actually fits with the whole idea. Isaiah says later on, Hashamayim kisi va'aretz adon maglai, the heavens are my throne, and the earth is my pedestal. So it's not that the ark is the throne, the ark is the pedestal. God himself, only his feet are on the earth, you would say, per se. So it's the same thing on Mount Sinai. If God himself completely came down Mount Sinai, the earth might have shattered. All we had there is maybe God presumably touching with his feet on Mount Sinai, and look how much chaos that created. It says, Veshulav melim et ha'echal. Now there's a debate. What is shulav? So shulav is the edges of something. But there's debate. Is it the edges of God or is it the edges of the throne? Probably the throne, because the last thing spoken about is the throne itself. But he sees the throne filling up the entire heichal. Heichal is usually it's a Sumerian word that got into Hebrew through the Akkadian, which usually means a large house or a palace. Here specifically, it is actually the temple itself. So he's seeing a vision inside the temple. He's seeing the opposite of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel sees the temple in ruins. Isaiah sees God still sitting in the temple, even with everything that was going on with later on Achaz, but even other kings before it, God was still in the temple. The other prophet, by the way, that speaks with God in the temple is actually Samuel. So there's some kind of equation here between Samuel and Isaiah, but Isaiah sees more. Samuel, who really starts classic prophecy, only hears a voice. Isaiah sees an image. But what's the difference? Isaiah is probably in a state of sleep or some kind of sleep. Well, Samuel was awake. Samuel is somewhere in between Moses and Isaiah. Moses saw an image and heard a voice, and he was awake. Isaiah sees an image and hears a voice, but he's asleep. Samuel in the middle is awake, but only hears a voice. It's an interesting thing. And all three of them, by the way, communicate with God at some stage or another through the temple. It's an interesting connection. And it says, Seraphim omdim mima'alo. So there's a group of angels known as Seraphim. Professor Slaiknol and others have recognized the word saraf to do with snakes. So there's actually this idea that there's this group of angels which are snakes, which have wings, which is not something we don't see, for example, in Egyptian imagery. You can debate if that's really what it is, but the snake has, according to this opinion, the snake has some kind of holiness to it. And the snake started off as some kind of, and this, by the way, might be the discussion where people say that the devil or the Satan was some kind of high-level angel, one of the seraphim, and he fell and he was a snake, and so that's probably how people make the connections. Some people argue seraphim are snakes, some people might argue they aren't. Omdim mima'alo, are standing above him. Now this is an interesting debate. Usually they say this still refers to the throne. Why? Because nothing can be above God. So they're standing above the throne, they're ready to serve God, but they're not hovering above God. I usually shiver a little bit when I read these descriptions because we're talking about the divine realm. It's something that 99.9% of mankind never gets to see. It says, Shesh kenafayim le'echad. It says 6 wings to each one. It doesn't mean that they have 6 pairs of wings. It actually means that they have 6 wings, 3. And it specifies, with 2 he covers his face. Why? Because he's in the presence of God. Nothing sees God. 2 he covers his feet. So if this is a snake, this is a snake with legs or something. Why cover the legs? Some kind of modesty, maybe. With 2 he flies. I'm using here some kind of an interpretation that is some rabbinic sources interpret this way. And then we hear one of the most famous statements in the Bible. It says, "V'kara zeh el zeh ve'amar." They call one to one another, and they called out together, "Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh, Adonai Tzevaot, Meloch ha'aretz kevodo." Now we use this in Jewish liturgy in the Amidah, which is the silent prayer that we recite afterwards again out loud between the second and third blessing of that prayer. We have the Kedusha, where we imitate the angels and we say the same things. It's holy, holy, holy. Triple, repeating something 3 times is an absolute. You can say something is holy if you say holy, holy. Kodesh, Kodeshim, very holy. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is supreme holiness. There's nothing above that. So only God is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And it specifies Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts, and the hosts are around him. And the entire earth is full of his glory. And it says, Vayanu amot asipim mikol hakoreh v'habayit maleh ashan. Okay? And it says, Vayanu amot asipim. Amot asipim are some supporting columns in some way or another. An amma usually is an arm, but an amma can also be some kind of beam. It's usually named by the fact that it might have been a cubit long, or that they measured them based on cubits. But these columns or these supporting beams start moving from the voice of the angels. Reminds us a lot of the idea of the sound of the shofar on Mount Sinai, and maybe even a reality of the earth shatter and moving. From the sound of the calling. And the house fills with smoke. Again, very similar to the imagery of Mount Sinai. There's smoke and darkness and so on. So Isaiah sees this and he goes into shock. And the people go into shock as well. You go back to Deuteronomy, it says that the people asked for Moses, don't let God speak to us. It's too much. So he's very shocked, but he utters something that actually enrages God. And actually God sends someone to purify him. And he says, V'omar oy lichi nidmeti. Says, woe to me, for I am going to die. So this is from the word domin. But it's interesting because nidmeti sounds like the word dama, which is to see something which is similar or parallels. So it's an interesting play on words here, in my opinion. But here specifically says, I am going to become like domin. Domin is the compost, the garbage that you use to fertilize the earth. He says, I am dead. I am going to be like what feeds the earth. He says, Ki ish tameh sefatayim anochi, for I am a man of unclean lips. What does he mean specifically? Unclean lips is a really, really interesting idea. But if we think about the fact that a prophet is supposed to be the mouthpiece of God, what he's really saying here is, I'm not worthy to be a prophet. He says, Ish tameh sefatayim. He might sometimes say things he's not supposed to say, but the reference to the lips is to do with him being a prophet and probably reflects on his entire being. But then he says something that's really interesting. He says, "Ubetoch am tameh sefatayim anochi yoshev, and I dwell in a nation of unclean lips." Well, I have to remember that earlier on we hear about Isaiah being told, Hashmen lev ha'am hazeh ve'oznav hashay, make the heart of these people fat and the ears blocked, and the idea that they're not supposed to receive prophecy. But here he says, I am unclean, the people I dwell with are unclean. He says, Ki et hamelech Adonai tzavot ro'eh einai, for the king, Lord of hosts, my eyes have seen. Refers to God as king. This actually proves what I said earlier, that God appears as king. He appears as king. Mount Sinai appears as king here. Here it's much more explicit. But in Mount Sinai, the sound of the shofar, the announcing and so on, and it's the style of a royal decree, proves Anochi Adonai Elohecha. It's a royal decree style type of speech. And he says, woe to me. I am unclean. I dwell in unclean people. And Midrash goes and says, very interestingly, you saying about yourself that you're unclean is perfectly fine, but don't call the people unclean. So this is why he has to be cleansed. The cleansing itself is directed towards him. And the verse 6 says, Vayaf elai echad min haserafim v'yado ritzpa b'melkachayim. It's an interesting thing. It says, one of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand he's holding coal. Ritzpah is very interesting. The term ritzpah is also used to talk about paving and so on. But here ritzpah is a piece of coal. But he's holding it with some kind of tweezers, some kind of holding mechanism. And he took it off of the altar. The altar here is probably the golden altar of the incense. The one act that's actually just making aroma, fragrance in the air. The one place, and there's a verse that says, "Tihit ferati ketot lefanecha masat kapayim minchat arev, akshiva kol shavati maki ve'eloi kelecha etparal." May my lips be, may my prayer be like the incense. The lifting of the hands at the prayer, at the offering of the end of the day. Listen, heed to my voice, my King and my God, for to you I will pray. That's actually might be an amalgamation of several verses. And the idea of an angel taking from the golden altar where they used to burn incense and put it on his lips, because that's what he does. Veigal pi vayomer, hine naga ze al sefatecha v'sar avonecha v'chatatcha techupar. Says, and he touched upon my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity has been removed, and your sin has been atoned for. It's interesting, the people's sin hasn't been atoned for. He needs to go out now and fix it. But we're cleansing you. But this also, the idea of the lips and the altar of the incense, there's an interesting link there through some principles. Maybe the incense was comparable in some people's minds to the idea of prayer as well. So, air that goes up, smoke, almost instantaneous. And God says, yes, okay, fine, you're a sinner, but I'm going to atone for you so you can actually speak to the people. God is not saying you're wrong about the people. What he's saying is that, yeah, you're right about yourself, and now I'm going to atone for you, and now you can speak. And he says in verse 8, Vaishma et kol Adonai omer, and I heard the voice of the Adonai again, not YHWH saying. This reminds me a lot of the story with King Yehoshaphat and Achav when they're at war with the Arameans, and the Michaihu, son of Yimlah, stands there, and there's this whole discussion, the false prophets of Achav, and they bring in Michaihu ben Yimlah, and he says, I saw a spirit going before God, and God's asking, who shall I send to be a spirit, who are sent to be a lie in the mouths of his prophets? So here's the opposite. Whoever do I send to actually speak and tell the people what I want them to hear? So we're looking into the sod. The sod is the Vayireh b'sod Adonai, so the secret of the Lord. The secret really is the assembly of God with his angels. The term later on takes this idea of secret. But really sod originally means just the king with his assembly of ministers. And he says, Vayishma et kol Adonai omer, et mi yashlach u'mi yelech lanu, va'omar hineni shelacheni. You understand? Second where I corrected myself and said hini and not hineni. And I actually explained this once before, but I explain it again here too. So I heard the voice of Adonai saying, who shall I send, and who will go for us, who will go in our behalf? And he says, behold, I am, send me. Why hini and not hineni? Hini is the correct way of pronouncing. Hineni is something that which was invented in Spain several hundred years ago and has been influencing Hebrew, but the Masoretes actually said it's supposed to be read as hini. It's a whole discussion about double consonants where the first one has a shva. So God hears him and says, "Vayomer lech v'karata la'am hazeh," and he said, "Go and he will ve'amarta la'am hazeh." I think I said v'karata. Vayomer lech ve'amarta la'am hazeh. Go and speak to and say to this people, "Shim'u shamoa ve'al tavinu ur'u ra'o ve'al tedau." Hear a rumor, but do not understand. Or hear, surely hear, but do not understand. See, surely see, and do not perceive. And this is what I said earlier. Hashmen lev ha'am hazeh va'oznav achbed ve'enav heisha. I mixed some of the verbs in, but it says, make their heart fat, and his ears heavy of hearing, and his eyes blocked. Penireh ve'enav va'oznav vishma. So in order that he does not, in case that it does happen, he doesn't want this to happen, he will see with his eyes and hear with his ears, and his heart would understand. Okay, by the way, notice the reversal. He goes heart, ears, eyes, and then it goes eyes, ears, heart. So his eyes will see, and his ears will hear, and his heart will understand. Veshav verafalo, and he will return, and he will be healed. He's actually saying, no, I'm blocking these people from understanding. It's a really interesting thing. Where's free will? And by the way, the same discussion, I had the same discussion years ago on a different podcast that I did about the weekly portion. Where was Pharaoh's free will? He let the people go. Where's his free will? So this is also another reason why this one's linked. Free will is being removed from here. That's the punishment. You don't have free will anymore. This is Va'omar, and he's standing there saying, oh wow, that's terrible. Va'omar ad matai Adonai. And I said, until when, Adonai? Vayomer ad asher imsha'u arim me'en yoshev uvatim me'en adam va'adama tish'e shemama. It's a terrible thing what he says here. Until the cities will be empty from no dwellers, and the houses from no people, and the earth will be desolate, completely desolate. This is not a happy prophecy from Isaiah. But this is already standing as a warning towards the end of the first part of the book of Isaiah, where he says, listen, the land's going to be destroyed. I'm warning you. And you're not going to understand who I am until that actually happens. God says, I have to take a drastic measure here for you to even start understanding what I'm doing, actually to listen to me. It says, verse 12, V'richak Adonai et ha'adam v'riba azuva b'kerev haaretz. And the Lord, and now it's Yud-Hei-Vav, and the Yud-Hei-Vav will distant man from the earth, and the abandonment will be great in the midst of the land. Now, the last verse here, verse 13, is a very, very difficult verse. The interpretations are many. It says, Ve'od ba Assyria, ve'shava v'ayta leva'ir ka'ala v'cha'alon, asher b'shalechet, matzevet bam, zera kodesh matzavta. So a tenth will be left, and it will return and be for consumption through fire. Like several types of trees, one of them is an oak, an elah. I can never remember where elah is, but it's apparently another. It's like two types of belonging to the oak family or something like that, which are like in the fall. But then matzevet bam zera kodesh matzavta. There's a lot of debate what actually means. But some people say, and in the end there will only be the trunk, but the trunk will be like a holy monument that will remind everyone. A lot of different opinions exactly what this verse specifically means, and I'm going to openly say I don't know. I really, really don't know. It's a very complicated, very, very complicated statement that a lot of ink has been poured on. He's saying there'll be some kind of remnant left, but he's not giving an optimistic outlook here about what's going to happen. And he's right. The devastation is massive. So because this ends in a pretty sad note, usually we end, the tradition is to end the Ashkenaz tradition and the Yemenite tradition. I think I got it wrong. I said in the early beginning, Sephardim go all the way to Sephardim and Temanim, what they do is they end at 6:13. The Yemenites actually add from chapter 9, verse 5 and 6. So if we go ahead and read that, it's supposed to end with something more positive. The Ashkenaz tradition reads ahead into 7:6, but also adds 9:5 to 6. It's really interesting. Sephardim end here. The Ashkenazim carry on all the way to 7:6, but add chapter 9 verses 5 and 6. The Yemenites go all the way like the Sephardim, but also add 9:5 to 6. That's a really, really interesting thing. It's an in-between situation. So it actually takes last two verses here about a redeemer. It says, Ki yeled yulad lanu, for a child is born to us. Ben nitan lanu, a son is given to us. Vayitiya misra al shichmo, and the misra will be upon his shoulders. Now the misra might actually be something specific that symbolizes his position, but the idea is that the ministry will be on his shoulders, or on his shoulders and the trap area. And his name will be, and there's always a lot of interesting discussions, Pele Yoetz El Gibor Aviad Sar Shalom. Are there just one long name? Are these titles and so on? So Pele Yoetz reminds us of Mafli, of great wisdom. He gives amazing or beyond knowledge advice. El Gibor, El could be a mighty El. This can be a reference to the idea of him being a mighty hero. Aviad son is written in one word or two words. An eternal father, and Sar Shalom, minister of peace. This is not really his name. These are titles that he receives. It says the Marbeha Misra Shalom in Ketz, to the increase of the position and to an everlasting peace. Rather than Marbe is actually written with a final mem, not a regular mem. This may actually be something, a leftover, something from the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, because this happens sometimes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Al Kiseh David v'al mamlachto, on the throne of David and upon his kingdom. Le'achin otah l'sa'adah, to prepare it and to support it. B'mishpat u'v'tzdaka, with justice and righteousness. So what a king's supposed to do, justice and righteousness. I've spoken about this before. The pillars are what a king is supposed to be. This is the ideal king. He has great wisdom. He's a mighty warrior. He's like a father. He's a minister of peace. He takes care of the people. Me'ata ve'ad olam, he says, Mishpatu b'tzdaka me'ata ve'ad olam, kinat Adonai tzavaot taseh. From now and to all eternity, the jealousy of the Lord of hosts will do this. God will intervene directly to bring a king of righteousness to redeem the people. So this is the thing you have to remember, that Isaiah, even the negativity that he sees, he also sees a lot of positive. He's expecting positive things to happen. And this is the thing we have to remember about life as well. We might think bad about ourselves, we might think bad about the world that surrounds us, and these things exist. We have to remember God's in charge, God has a plan. So at the end of it, even with all the troubles, we still have to have hope. And every time we speak about Isaiah, I always emphasize the issue of hope. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Like always, please share with your friends and family, comment, discussions, agree, disagree, it's up to you. The most important thing is for us to increase knowledge so we can understand the Tanakh, the Hebrew sources better. Kol Tov.